just to...
Yeah.
Good. Sorry about that.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Levin Jewish Community Center, our Southern Jewish Voices program. My name is Brooke Bowles. I'm the executive director here at the J, and we are so pleased to have Dr. Robert Levin joining us today to share his story. This is actually our third season of Southern Jewish Voices. We started this program about 2.5 years ago because we felt the stories of what it's like to be Jewish in Birmingham, Alabama and surrounding areas are really important to share and to hear, but also really, really important to preserve. So huge shout out to Jason Morales, who is recording the event for us today, and it will be on our website. These recordings on our website are getting hundreds and hundreds of views. So not only are we able to experience magic in this room right now, but we are able to share the magic to future generations. And also a special thanks to Margaret Norman, our moderator. Enjoy the show.
Okay, thank you, Brooke, and thank you, Robert, for being here with me today. I know many of you know him as Dr. Levin, and I've learned just in preparing for this interview just how many people Dr. Levin has cared for in this community, which has been really neat and something we're going to talk about. But I'm really excited to be here with you. I've gotten to know Robert a little bit as a member of my JCRC committee, and he has a really deep and rich Birmingham Jewish story to share. So with that, we're going to jump in, and as always, we're going to start by talking a little bit about family history. And so when you and I first spoke, I learned that you have really deep roots in this community and would love if you could share a little bit about those.
Thank you. And thank you, Margaret, for all of your help preparing for this. Our family does go way back, certainly in the Jewish history of Birmingham. They came here in 1888. Both sets of grandparents around that time, one maybe a year or two before the other. And I'll start by just telling you, my mother's name was Louise Ayland, and she was the daughter of Robert and Rebecca Ayland. And so let's just talk about each grandparent and how all that evolved. Rebecca Ayland's maiden name was Olam. She was Rebecca Olam. She was one of 5 children to Harris and Celia Olam. So as I said, and Harris Olam was one of 7 children, so it's quite a large family. And I do want to mention that Roz Kaplan is here today, and she's a member of that Olam family. It's something I really wasn't aware of until I was an adult. So it's one of the many, many family members that I have here that I really didn't know so well growing up. I certainly knew Roz, but not as a relative. So Harris Olam moved here. They lived on the north side, which is where most of the Jewish families lived. And when I say north side, they lived on 8th Avenue North, and they lived between 14th and 15th Street. And I've been by there. There's not very much there at this time. There's certainly no homes there. And Harris Olam very quickly became part of the Jewish community in that he was an original member of Knesseth Israel. He's on the document. And he was the treasurer, the first treasurer of that congregation. He's on one of those original stones that fortunately still exist, but that's about all that exists at KI today. And he became a grocer. He had a business on 4th Avenue North, which was the heart of the Jewish activity in Birmingham. And there were delicatessens, there were stores, but he had a wholesale grocery company, a business called Olam and Mendel Grocers. And we have pictures of horse-drawn carriages and a proud man standing in front. He was an imposing figure. He was 6'5". He had red hair and blue eyes. And I think that's where some of the height came from in my mother's family, which I'll mention in a moment. But he lived that life. And then I want to mention, though, that in 1896, my grandmother, Rebecca Olam, who became Rebecca Olam Ayland, was in the first confirmation class at Temple Emanu-El with Rabbi Morris Newfield, first confirmation class that he had. So it's a rich history in both of those congregations. It's unclear to me if he had membership in both congregations. I'm not sure. And for those of you who are interested, those congregations, those buildings, those original KI buildings and Temple Emanu-El buildings were on 17th Street. One was on 7th Avenue North, that was KI. and Temple Emanu-El was on the corner of 17th Street and 5th Avenue North. Of course, those buildings are long gone at this point. But there was a proximity, and that's where the Jewish families lived. The YMHA, which is the Young Men's Hebrew Association, the forerunner of this JCC, was just a few blocks away on 18th Street. So that was their life. My grandfather was an only child, whereas my grandmother was one of 5 children, but he was an only child, and his parents were Louis and Rachel Ayland. And he had 7 children, my mother being one of the 2 girls, and then my mother had 5 brothers. And all of the Ayland men stayed in Birmingham, and they all entered the retail business. They came here via Minneapolis, and they came here to join the Goldstein family, which was another large part of my family here. And they joined them in the retail business. And then my grandfather struck out on his own and started a business called Ideal Millinery. And it was on 19th Street between 1st and 2nd Avenue North. That building is still there today. And then a number of years later, when Sears Roebuck moved to a larger location, he took over a building at the corner of 18th Street and 2nd Avenue North and called it the New Ideal, where his business prospered and he did extremely well. And my father and 3 of my uncles worked with him there. Today, some of you know that building, and I do want to mention that the Krells currently live in that building.
Okay,
Today.
it comes full circle.
And they seem quite happy here, I'm glad to say. And so it does come full circle, and so that building is still standing. But in addition to that New Ideal business, my father and uncles struck out on their own in the early 60s, and they formed a business called Ayland's, and they had 4 or 5 stores in the greater Birmingham area. Another uncle had the Emily shop for those women who shopped at that. It was a beautiful store. It's 5 points south. And my aunts in the 1950s, which was most unusual for women at that time, opened their own business called the Village Sportswear. And so Jeanette and Ellen Ayland had that business until they sold to the current owner. So the family was quite busy in the retail business here and active at Temple Emanu-El, active at KI, and then other members, especially on the Olam side, were members at Beth-El and KI.
Yeah, that's such a rich history. We're going to talk a little bit more, I know, about your family's context as merchants here in Birmingham, but I want to ask you, you have these connections to all 3 congregations, but I know that you grew up primarily at Temple Emanu-El. Can you tell me a little bit about, your experience as a child, as part of Temple Emanu-El? And I know particularly we talked a little bit about the influence of Rabbi Grafman on you.
Sure. Yes, we were active members at Temple Emanu-El, and I attended religious school. It wasn't a choice in those days. We went, and then I went to Hebrew school twice a week. I became a bar mitzvah, and then I stayed on for confirmation as well. But it was something that I enjoyed, and I think kids, it's maybe hard going to Hebrew school, especially when you have to play sports and have other activities. But looking back on it, I'm glad I had the experience. But we were regular members. We attended services regularly. We celebrated all the holidays, and we were participants. I even stayed on and taught Hebrew to kids when I was in high school. I did that, and Rabbi Grafman had a profound influence on me and on many of my friends as we grew up. Some of them are in this room today, and they're still very involved in the Jewish community. So I think he had his imprint. He came to Birmingham in 1941 and served our congregation for 35 years as rabbi. He then stayed on after retirement as emeritus for another 20 years until his death. He was a classical reform rabbi in every sense of the word. He had a powerful voice. He believed in decorum. Yeah, I hear
some people agree.
But no, the service started on time. It ended on time. You didn't get up and walk out of the building, out of the sanctuary. He was a staunch Zionist from the start. He spoke up he was a civil rights advocate. He frequently mentioned the 6 million who perished in the Holocaust. He was a great teacher, and more than anything, he was dedicated to the members of our congregation. He was there all the time. He was a workhorse. And I think he was really a brilliant and articulate man, but he had his way of doing things. Now, on the other side, he had a great sense of humor, a very playful way about him at times. He drove a sports car. He was a snazzy dresser. And also, he had stadium certificates at Legion Field. So what that meant was he had two 50-yard line tickets for every Alabama home game, or Auburn in those days. And if you were really lucky, he would ask you to go to the game with him. And I only remember that happening a couple of times because he spread it around to everybody. But on Saturday mornings, when we had regular services in those days, if there was an Alabama kickoff at 1 o'clock, you knew you were going to get out of Temple on time.
Okay, well, I can definitely see how this might tie to your love of sports, and we'll get there too. But I guess I'm kind of curious, like, if you had to distill sort of one thing you really learned from him or took from the time you spent with him, what would it be?
He loved his religion, his God, his faith. He was a dedicated Jewish man, and he taught us that. He wanted more than anything for one of us to go to Cincinnati and go to Hebrew Union College, which was something I considered my freshman year in college. It was a brief consideration, but I thought about it. And so I don't know that wasn't one word, but was that?
I think it was one sentence, so okay, you got it. You got it.
Good.
One word is hard. Okay, interesting. Well, tell me a little bit more about just growing up in Birmingham as a young Jewish person during the time that you did. It was
an idyllic childhood. I'm fortunate that some of my friends from my elementary school and my neighborhood are sitting right at this table, and that thought in and of itself is really remarkable when you're 76 years old and you're still having your best friends from childhood that are still your dear friends is more than average, I would say, and it's thrilling. So we were free-range kids. You know, we were sent outside, we rode our bikes, we played sports constantly. I'm not sure what else we did other than play sports and just play. And it was wonderful. So, and I never had experiences with overt anti-Semitism. Sure, there was a set of rules that we were handed, just like our parents were handed, in that my dear friends would go to their country club. We weren't members or allowed to be members of those country clubs, but we had our own country clubs. So it's not as we led a privileged life just like they did. But so I can't say that we were wanting for anything, but it was different. It was different. And the only thing I would say of a negative nature is that in high school there were fraternities and sororities we were not allowed to be part of. And I was thinking about it, that a lot of my friends were Christian, especially that I played sports with. And that sort of startled me when 10th grade came around, and they were sort of doing their thing socially, and we were sort of doing some things together, but we were not allowed to participate in all of those. So I think that was hurtful at the time, but I also had a large number of Jewish friends. So again, it just meant perhaps I was spending more time with them.
Well, and that's actually a great segue, because one thing that sort of struck me in our initial conversation that you talked about was feeling like there was a real sense of cohesion in the Jewish community during the time that you were growing up, and wondering if you could speak a little bit more to what you mean by that.
I felt as though growing up here, and because we by whatever happenstance, we did spend time together, and we were thrown together. And so these, I don't mean thrown together, but we ended up together for many activities. And our parents were friends, we became friends, and those have led to lifelong friendships, which is truly remarkable to me, that we're all friends to this day. And so I think that's what I'm saying. I think it was a tightly knit community. In those days, most of the Jews lived in Mountain Brook and some in Homewood. It's a little different today in that it's more diffuse.
Yeah.
Some people don't realize there were actually restrictive covenants in certain communities, Vestavia being one of them. So Jews could not buy homes in Vestavia. It still throws me today when one of my Jewish friends, or I meet somebody who's Jewish who lives in Vestavia, and I might think that, but I don't. You know, it's very different today. That does not exist. Yeah. But so I think Jewish families lived in more places than they used to. There were only 2 elementary schools in Mount Brook when I was growing up, and so we were all together. Today, therefore, it's a bigger community and more diffuse.
Yeah,
Diverse, I guess you would say.
No, that's interesting. I guess one more question I have on that, because we've talked about the different congregations, and this is something that's come up in several of our interviews. I'm sort of curious, like, did you have friends who were also going to Temple Beth-El or KI or sort of?
It was a little more separate in those days, I would say, because you really didn't, prior to, say, junior high school, I didn't really know a lot of the people at Beth-El. And even the country clubs were sort of divided by temples.
Yeah.
The Jews that went to Temple Emanu-El were members of Hillcrest, which was a club over, say, in the Edgewood area, for those that don't know or wouldn't know about that. And then Temple Beth-El was located where Protective Life Insurance Company is now, and that was more members of Temple Beth-El was located over. They were members of Fairmont. So there was a distinction. There was some crossover. People would tell you that they were the unusual ones that were members of Temple Emanu-El and they went to Fairmont. It wasn't that big a deal. But there was a separate kind of nature, and sometimes you grew up not knowing those families as well. And when I refer back to the Olo family, many of those family members ended up at KI and Beth-El, and it wasn't until I started doing family tree, digging, that I learned that I had all these relatives over there. And I guess our family, the Aylen and Goldstein family, was so big that it was more than enough people to be with. It was hard to keep up with all of them, much less the Olos too. So.
Yeah, I did think that was so interesting that when we talked about family history at first, that you realized you had all these cousins so many years later here in Birmingham.
Well, and as I contact them, and I'll tell them, I said, I've known you all my life. We're third cousins, and I would say that some of them are sort of moderately interested in that. So it may be more interesting to me than a lot of people. That's okay. It doesn't hurt my feelings.
Well, let me ask you one more sort of family and growing up question. We did talk a little bit about the fact that your families were merchants here in the community. And of course, we know part of that story relates to everything that happened here with civil rights in the 1950s and 1960s and the boycotts. And, I guess what I'm really interested in hearing from you about, and what we've already talked a little bit about, is sort of how aware were you of what was happening in the city and how that impacted some of your family businesses?
We lived in a very sheltered community. We were over the mountain. There wasn't a Red Mountain Expressway. I always felt like we were in our little, cocoon over in Mount Brook. So the bombing, say, occurred in 1963 when I was 15. Mm-hmm. And those were days of boycotts, and those were days of unrest in Birmingham. And what I remember was that my father would just say, don't come downtown. You don't need to come down. And when I say going downtown, we would typically go down. We had Saturday school as we got older, so we go to religious school on Saturday. Then we would take a bus and go down and go to the movies. We'd visit our parents, many of whom were retailers, and have lunch or go to the movies and take the bus home. And we probably did that from the time we were 11 or 12 and up, if not younger. But he just said, stay away. And I know the stores were boycotted. I don't remember any terrible incidents in the store. And it was only 6 blocks or so away from the church. The New Ideal was, just not far at all.
And you're talking about the 16th Street Baptist.
I'm talking about the bombing of the 16th Street Baptist, September of 1963. And that's all I know. But now we didn't protest. We weren't involved in it as teenagers. And I think my parents were not activists. I know there were people who were more involved than they were, and some worked behind the scenes, but I don't remember much about that. So it always makes me feel somewhat guilty to say those things, but those were the facts. I mean, that's the way it was. So it didn't really affect our day-to-day life at all.
Yeah.
So.
No, that makes sense. Actually, I have an off-script question now that I'm sort of curious about, because you brought up the 16th Street Baptist Church bombing, but were you... did you listen to Rabbi Grafman's sermon?
I've heard it many times.
Were you there?
I have a copy of it. I can't say specifically I was there. I'm going to assume I was there that
But you
night.
must have 15. So.
Right, but our family would regularly be in services. But I have a copy of it, and I still maintain a friendship with Stephen Grafman, his son, so we're in touch. We had a special relationship with Rabbi Grafman in that he and his family would attend my grandparents break fast on Yom Kippur, and they're Seder. And when my grandmother died in 1954, my mother assumed those responsibilities of the Jewish holidays, and the Grafmans joined us. So they always came to our Seders and our break fast. So we had a very close relationship. But then I wasn't the only person. Rabbi Grafman had a whole flock of people that he called his boys, and they were basically his bar mitzvah boys. And those that had trained under him developed this same close relationship that I had. And he called on us to help teach or help mentor younger boys. And unfortunately, it was the times, because I know my sister wanted to become a bat mitzvah, and she was unable to do that. It didn't make her very happy. But that's just the way it was in those days. Again, classical reform.
Yeah, it's so interesting. Well, I'm going to transition us a little bit because I know we have a lot more to talk about in your later life too. And to start, I mean, I guess just tell me a little bit about, leaving Birmingham, where you went after high school, and also, did you always know you would come back?
I didn't. I attended college at the University of Pennsylvania. Oddly, I got a degree in business and then I changed my mind and took science courses, went to medical school. That's the short story. I ended up in Atlanta at Emory for my residency, where I met my wife, who was getting a graduate degree. We married there, and the only debate was whether we were going to stay in Atlanta or Birmingham, because there were opportunities there. Came back here in 1979 and have been practiced medicine here ever since. I was with the group for a brief time, and then I started my own practice, which has been one of the most fulfilling things I've ever done, and retired 3 years ago after 43 years of practice.
And I'm going to ask you more about your practice, but before I do, and I know your wife Faye is here with us today, but we talked a little bit too about the fact that she's from a smaller community, and so curious, what you learned too in meeting her about sort of small town Jewish life.
Her story is remarkable in and of itself too, because it was her grandfather, who was a peddler, was sent down to the area near Opelika, ended up in the Alexander City area prior to Lake Martin being built, and ended up owning a store. And then that led to a series of stores. I think he had perhaps 8 stores or more in small towns in Alabama, such as Sylacauga, Childersburg. Alexander City was extremely successful, and his son, Faye's father, took over that business, and he was the one that really grew it to what it was. She came from a town of 3 Jewish families. She commuted to Montgomery, which is 55 miles away, and attended the Reform congregation there. And so Judaism and being Jewish was a very important part of her life. And she, sort of like me, never really had any encounters with anti-Semitism, and led another idyllic life here in Alexander City.
Yeah, it's so interesting. And, I was sort of interested to hear about it too, because we had such a great interview with Ronnie Hess, who I know is here also, about her experiences in Jasper. So I know we've talked about some of the overlaps there. But next, I'd like to go into your career. And we have a couple different, things that I know we're going to touch on here. But to start, just talk a little bit about, why being a pediatrician, why did that route appeal to you in particular? And what are some of sort of the most satisfying things that have come out of that path for you?
My big choices at the time, finishing medical school, were OBGYN or pediatrics. For whatever reason, I chose pediatrics. Certainly glad I did that. And it suited me for many reasons. And I always enjoyed my involvement with families and children, and the ongoing relationships, watched from birth till sometimes in their 20s, even had a few in their 30s show up. And
that's kind of impressive.
Yeah, well, my staff didn't think so, but nevertheless. But I enjoyed it. And I think when you make a difference with a child or do something remarkable, it's life-changing. So I like that, and I think I like the variability of it all. We saw families from all over the city. We started off at St. Vincent's in that building before we built a building in Homewood. And so we really drew people from all over the city and really outside of Birmingham, not unlike other pediatric practices. I don't think we were unique in that sense, but I was always amazed at who was in all the different rooms, and the variability of what you were seeing. So yeah. I enjoyed it. And to this day, the most gratifying thing is, almost on a daily basis, I see people from the practice. I see the parents, I see the children, I see the patients themselves. I bump into them. I could be taking a walk, I could be in a store, I could be in a restaurant. It's rarely a day will go by where I don't see some or a number of people that were in our practice. So it's gratifying. And to hear the stories and their remarks are heartwarming. I think you witnessed one of those today.
I did, literally while we were like walking up to the stage, so I've seen that in action,
Right.
and it does seem very gratifying.
It is.
Before we go on with career, I'm kind of curious too. I know that you weren't gone all that long, but what was it like to come back to the community where you grew up and to sort of did you see Birmingham in a new way when you came back? Or I'm curious what that experience of leaving and coming back was like.
And as far as that decision, by the way, I don't think I said that, but I felt as though coming to a city like Birmingham you were more able to make a difference and be part of things that you might not be able to do in a bigger city like Atlanta. And I think that has proven to be true in many of the things in our lives. But plus our families were here. My parents were alive. Faith's parents were 70 miles from here. So we had the opportunity to raise our children with grandparents, and it was heartwarming. It was wonderful to be part of them. And we visited them in Alexander City and Lake Martin, and then they were able to come up here frequently on a moment's notice. So it was a terrific decision in retrospect.
Yeah.
But did the city change? Sure, the city has changed, and it continues to change. And I like many of the changes that have occurred here, and being involved in things not just in the Jewish community, but outside the Jewish community as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, we can talk a little bit more about that too. But on this sort of theme of making an impact, one thing I want to talk to you about also is your TV career as a doctor, and wondering if you could talk a little bit more about how you got involved with the local news and what that looked like, and what sort of impact you think that had.
Sure, and I want to thank Joyce Johnson, former producer at Channel 6, for being here today, and she's one of the wonderful people I've worked with there. But in 1986, a flyer was sent out by the Medical Society and to say they were going to expand the Channel 6 News, which was the ABC affiliate at that time, from 30 minutes to 1 hour, and have an interview segment, much like what we're doing.
Yeah.
And so they would have physicians come up and interview other physicians or psychologists or someone else in healthcare and ask them questions for about a 5-minute segment. So they said, come up and try out. There must have been about 40 of us that did it. All of us thought we could be stars. And so they picked 6 of us. 2 would do Monday, 2 Wednesday, 2 Friday. That evolved. They took the show back to 30 minutes, and they asked me to stay on, so I did. So I did that for 10 years.
Wow.
And what I would do is I'd do a different segment. It could be on the importance of getting a flu vaccine, or it could be a breaking story like it's time to turn babies over from stomach to their back for safe sleeping positions to lower the incidence of crib death or SIDS. It could be getting the safest bike helmet. There were a million segments that we did. And I have them all recorded, so maybe that'll be another session where we'll come in here and watch those.
Yeah, it's great.
But I cannot tell you how gratifying that was, because it was a public service, because we were giving out good information. So I'd like to thank Medical Information. So I had to brush up, I had to learn it, I had to be able to say it, but it was also a lot of fun, and people like Joyce made it fun. And there's so many funny things that happened along the way, but one of my favorites, for example, they didn't teach us anything. They just put us out there. And I did attend my favorite medical meeting I ever attended, which was in New Orleans, and it was the AMA meeting on broadcast journalists. And they had Art Lean and Timothy Johnson and all the big stars of national health information broadcasters teaching us how to speak and how to turn to the camera and how to do it and how to make a story, and it was wonderful. And Joyce, I still remember where I would say, okay, Dr. Levin, and then when you're done, you're going to pitch it back to Bill Boland, who was my partner with a lot of these. He was a wonderful broadcaster for many years here. And I'll never forget, because I go, well, thank you, and thank you for that wonderful information about the flu vaccine, and we know how important it is. And now here's Phil with a bite for Mr. Food. So anyway, some things you never forget. But and then we started filming the interviews. We rode bicycles. We had bike helmets on. We went and picked out the safest car seat. We told people what fireworks not to buy.
Yeah.
And of course, I ended up buying a bunch of fireworks to take on the set and show it to them. So what would I do? I'd give them to my kids at Levin. And so it was a great run of 10 years, you know. So.
Yeah, and I feel like you were starting to get at this a little bit, but do you think that it, positively influenced, your practice at all, like in how you were delivering information or how you related to people? Like,
well, I was sort of getting started in those days. I think people knew who I was, and maybe that helped. I wasn't really necessarily thinking that was why I was doing it. I just liked it. It was kind of fun.
It does sound like a lot of fun. And this kind of transitions me into my next question, which is, I know everybody here knows that you are the voice of the $1 Million Band, which I'll just show my stripes here. I know nothing about football, and Robert was very kind to explain many things to me about the band and the team and how I should go see my first football game and all of this. So I really enjoyed learning more about how you got into that role and what that entails. And so I'm hoping you can tell us a little bit about what that's meant to you in your life.
Well, it's been a remarkable experience, and it was all happenstance. I was at Faye's high school reunion in 1990 at Benjamin Russell High School, and one of her classmates, Catherine Scott, was the band director at Alabama. And I'd seen her at games, but I really didn't know Catherine very well, so I went up to her at a party the night before the reunion and said, Catherine, I grew up in Birmingham. My father was a retailer. He worked on Saturdays, but we'd get a ride out to Legion Field. And there was an announcer that had this certain voice. I think it was Davenport Smith, for those of you who went to elementary school with me. There, certain voice, certain cadence. And I like to do imitations of people.
Yeah.
So I did my imitation for Catherine. She thought it was funny and said, you'll do a game for us. I said, sure, I'll do a game for you. Just let me know. Fast forward to the opening game that year. We played Southern Miss, Brett Favre, if y'all remember him, and Southern Miss beat us that day on one of those 95-degree days at Legion Field. And I had Gary, now 42, who's 8 years old, and I had him by the hand, and he was ready to go at the end of the third quarter. Actually, I was too. And so I said, well, let's go see the lady on the ladder, and we'll talk to her and see the band. They're playing all the music. I said, hi, Catherine, I'm Robert Levin, I'm Faye Cohen's husband. And she looked at me and said, you're doing LSU game. And I went, oh my God, she's serious about this. So I did a game that year and took my boys, and I want to compliment my photographer who I brought with me. He's sitting right here, okay? Donald Hess, my dear friend, was so amused by this whole story that he wanted to go with me, and he took one of the big clunky VHS cameras. And so I have that. That'll be another show.
Yeah, we should have brought that with us.
Should have brought that, yeah. And so I go out and I do a game, and he came right up in the press box with me. And my favorite moment of that day was when we got to the press box door, which is, I didn't realize what a sacred place it is. And you have a credential, a media credential, and the guy looks at me and says, okay. And he says, who's he? And I looked back at Donald, who was holding the camera and laughing. And I said, my photographer. So they let him in. Never happened since, 34 years. So anyway, I did the game. It was a blast. And then Catherine asked me to do it full time after that. And I've done it for 34 years. So I continue to do all the home games and away games as the band goes, which has included taking us to bowl games all over, 7 national championship games. Just to be part of all that and to be there, it's thrilling. And so I'd like to, it's been a joy, is what I would say. And that's led to other public address opportunities. I do it for the Southeastern Conference for the last 20 years. I do the baseball tournament at the Hoover Metropolitan Stadium, and I get to do play-by-play for that. I've been asked to do voiceovers. I've done, I know Gary Weinberger was here. He called me with one of my favorites also. He said, I've got a job you're going to really like. And I said, what is that? And he said, there's a Tim McGraw Faith Hill concert at the BJCC, and 2 radio stations are sponsors. Neither wants the other person to introduce Gentleman Faith. So they needed a neutral announcer. And I
That's
said,
great.
"Have I got a guy for you?" So he knew who to call, and I got to stand, to do that. And so, but other things like that have come my way just for that reason. I've emceed a number of events and so forth. So one thing led to another. I have no formal training in any of this, but it's been a lot of fun. So.
Well, this was by audience request, but could you give us just a snippet of your announcer voice? Someone did ask me this when I was coming up here. Not to put you on the spot.
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the 400 outstanding members of the University of Alabama $1 Million Band.
I have to say, that is really good.
It's really not me. It's the imitation of that announcer.
Yeah. Well, tell us a little bit too about this is, I know that this has come up a few times throughout that you really are a lifelong sports fan. Can you tell me about other ways in which sports have come into your life? And I know the Barons is one that we wanted to touch on.
Shortly after we married and coming back to Birmingham, Birmingham had been without a minor league baseball team since 1975. So from 1975 to 1980, there was a void. A group of businessmen got together under the direction with Art Clarkson, thank you. But he organized it. He came in from Omaha and organized some men, but it was Al Van Hoos and John Forney that called the meetings. John Forney was in the advertising business. Al Van Hoos was the sports editor of the Birmingham News, a dear friend of my father's. Dad had been a lifelong baseball fan, attended the World Series every year, one way or another. And so they had these meetings. Bottom line was we bought, a group of us, I joined them, bought the Montgomery Rebels, a AA affiliate of the Detroit Tigers, moved them to Birmingham, rehabilitated Rickwood Field to some degree, and played games there. It was wonderful. Dad was the president of the ball club. We owned him for 10 years. We won 3 Southern League pennants during that time. So this poor kid from New York had this opportunity to be the head of be president of a baseball club. It became so popular, though, that somebody made us an offer of the Suntory Corporation. We sold the team in 1990. We did not want to, but the others did, so we had no choice. After being at Rickwood until 1987, it was time to move to another location for many reasons. Our general manager talked to different communities in Birmingham, including Trussville, Homewood, City, Birmingham again, and ended up moving the team to the Hoover Stadium, and where it thrived, and until they moved back to Birmingham. So, but it was a wonderful experience that has continued the tradition of my father attending the World Series every year, thanks to the Detroit Tigers and the Chicago White Sox. And to this day, they're kind enough to allow me to go. So I take my family, I've taken friends, and have a long streak of attending the World Series every October. So,
I think you actually counted. How many World Series have you been to?
I don't know the number. I think it's between 45 and 50 World Series.
It's amazing.
And it's been 46 Major League ballparks and 27 of the 30 franchises. But who's counting?
So everybody remember this information because we're going to circle back to it in a minute. But before we do, I have one more sort of Jewish community question, which is, we haven't really touched on your leadership in the Jewish community. So tell me a little bit about some of the roles that you've held and some of the projects you've worked on that have been most impactful.
Most of my Jewish community work has been at Temple Emanu-El. That's been the most important thing to me. And there were a few of us that started there at a young age when there weren't a lot of young people that were getting involved at the temple in those days. So stayed on the board for many, many years, and then became president of the congregation and was head of several committees afterwards and tried to improve things at Temple, and then have been involved and head up some of the search committees for Rabbi, still here, and Cantor, and even as far back as Jonathan Miller's rabbi. So maintained a close relationship with clergy and been involved at Temple, both officially and unofficially since then. Also been involved with other organizations I'm extremely proud of and fond of. Collat Jewish Family Services. My wife was the president the last 2 years. I was fortunate to be asked to help chair the Hands Up Together fundraiser the last 2 years. My Toby, I think you might be out there. okay, Toby Siegel, and so I've had this opportunity to work with wonderful people, and we raised more money last year than ever been raised by
Wow.
CGFS. So I hope my involvement with things like that will continue. And I want to mention I was on the board here at the JCC in those early days, and being in this room is very provocative for me because when I was on the board here, we had a speakers bureau called the Forum Series. And when I mentioned it to Brooke earlier, there was no memory of that, but we had some of the best speakers, and they would appear on this very stage where we would introduce them. I'm going to name a few. We had Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin.
Wow.
Right here. I mean, it was unbelievable. And I also remember being in that library just down the hall. There was no security. I mean, Johnny Peoples was our only security for those of you who remember Johnny. So it's amazing. And we had Isaac Bashevis Singer, the poet and writer and Nobel laureate. We had another Nobel laureate and professor and scholar and Holocaust survivor, Elie Wiesel, thank you. We had Chaim Potok. We had Rabbi Harold Kushner, who wrote that book, When Bad Things Happen to Good People. And we would fill this auditorium for those talks, and I don't know what happened to it. Maybe this is the inspiration to bring something like that back, but that was very meaningful to me to be involved with that.
Yeah, it sounds like an amazing series, and how neat for you to now be on this stage.
On this very stage.
Yeah. Well, my last question for you, and this is sort of just a fun closing question that does circle back to the Barons, and I'll tell a little story as part of it, which is that some of y'all remember when Alex Edelman came through the Federation in August, and I had a meeting with Robert the next morning, and when I met with him, he said, "You'll never believe who I just dropped off at the airport," and it was Alex Edelman. And I'm curious if you could tell us a little bit about the 24 hours, basically, that you spent with him after that event.
No, Alex Edelman is now a Tony Award-winning and Emmy Award-winning comedian. He is an Orthodox Jew from Boston. And we went to the event at the Red Mountain Theater, and shortly after sitting down, the people next to us said, "Alex Edelman's going to the Barons game after this." And I went, "What?" So I quickly sent a text to Danny Cohn and said, "Danny, if Alex Edelman is going to the Barons game, I would like to take him, or help him get there." And Danny, who was walking out on the stage a moment later, texted me right back. So he's a very good responder. And so he said, I'll get with you right after. So sure enough, right after it was over, he waved Faye and me over. And we joined Rebecca Rothman. Rebecca, you're here somewhere. She just left. Okay, that's okay. But anyway, she's a rising comedic star in the community, by the way. And so we walked him over to Regent's Field. We met up with Jonathan Nelson, the general manager of the Barons, who's a friend of mine, and he gave us a tour of the field. And what I didn't realize is Alex Edelman spent 10 years in Major League Baseball, primarily with the Boston Red Sox and also with the Los Angeles Dodgers. And so they had lots to talk about. I stood back and just sort of watched all this develop. He took in the ballpark. He loved it. He sat down. He heckled players like I've never heard someone heckle, with lines that were just, really extraordinary, hilarious. Wow. Then we walked back to the Red Mountain Theater parking lot. We said goodnight, and I said, Alex, you like this so much. How would you like to see the oldest ballpark in the United States? So he said, I'd love to, because his flight went until like 11 o'clock. So I said, we can do this. So picked him up early the next morning, met Gerald Watkins, the mastermind of Major League Baseball, of Rickwood, and the man solely responsible for bringing Major League Baseball to Rickwood Field this past summer with the Giants-Cardinals game. And we toured Rickwood Field, went out on the field, we threw the ball around, and Alex, I think, had the time of his life. And then I dropped him at the airport. So it was a magical experience for me to combine Orthodox Jewry, baseball, Rickwood Field, and comedy all together. It was it was really like a trifecta or more. So it was
Well,
a great experience.
An amazing level of hospitality, and I wanted to end on it because I think it really says something about your personality and spirit, and I love how it combined all those things for you too. So with that, I'm going to thank you for your time and for being here with us today, and we'll give you a round.
Can I say one more thing?
Yes, of course.
I
Yeah.
couldn't have done any of the things that I've done in my life without my wife. And I just wanted to say that. So I don't want to get too schmaltzy. For those of you who don't know what verklempt was, it's what I just did. That's the guy verklempt. But she was there with me every step of the way of my medical practice. She did all the finances for it. She too is an extraordinary volunteer and human being. And God bless her for sticking with me all these 45 years. So anyway.
Well, that's actually the best thing.